Welcome to History Lost in Time, from one enthusiast to others. And welcome to the first episode from the section General Modern German History. The topic of today is radio, which is rather fitting for a podcast. This will also start a small series of episodes, and I start with radio during the Weimar Republic, because that's where radio broadcasting really starts in Germany. Why this topic today? This is a topic that I am personally invested in, and it might be interesting to listeners of podcasts as well. After all, a podcast isn't that much different than a radio report. Even though TV and internet-based media have overtaken radio a bit, radio is still the fastest medium there is, and also very widespread. Political background and commentary. No political background with this topic. However, you can find out how politics and the media have always been intertwined. This is nothing new. The sources. I will use two German language books. Rundfunk in Deutschland, Herausgeber Hans Bausch, Band 1, Winfried B. Lerck, Rundfunkpolitik in der Weimar Republik, which basically means Radio Broadcasting in Germany, published by Hans Bausch, Part 1 by Winfried B. Lerck, Radio Broadcasting Policy in the Weimar Republic, published by Deutscher Taschenbuchverlag, München 1980, and Programmgeschichte des Hörfunks in der Weimarer Republik, Band 1 und 2, Herausgeber Joachim Felix Leonhardt, which means Program History of Radio Broadcasting in the Weimar Republic, Parts 1 and 2, published by Joachim Felix Leonhardt, published by Deutscher Taschenbuchverlag, München 1997. Both are rather detailed and recommended. Very late while making this episode, I found one quote in this third book. Zuhören und gehört werden 1. Radio im Nationalsozialismus zwischen Lenkung und Ablenkung. Translation, listening and being listened to 1. Radio during National Socialism, from controlling to distracting. Published by Inge Marsolek and Adelheid von Saldern. Published by Edition Discord, Tübingen, 1998. The history of radio broadcasting is closely tied to the history of radio technology itself. Radios were already around before World War I, for instance on ships. Everyone who knows a bit about the RMS Titanic, and even if it's just watching a movie about it, should know that the Titanic had a radio on board which was used to send out distress calls, which in turn made rescuing the survivors possible. During World War I, the importance of radio technology increased drastically. However, radios at that time were fairly large and clunky, so they were often used stationary or on ships. The importance of radio technology is mirrored by the size of the telegraph forces within the German army. By the end of the war, they consisted of 5,700 officers and 185,000 men. After the war, these men organized themselves in radio clubs and helped drive the development. In Germany, the Reich Postal Ministry was in charge of radio technology and frequencies. That may be a bit surprising, but back then the Postal Ministry wasn't just responsible for transporting letters and parcels, but also for the entire telecommunications within Germany. So telephones, radio, and that which would become television. A key figure in the development of radio broadcasts was Hans Bredow, who started as an engineer at the AEG company and later worked for Telefunken. He was heading the radio telegraphy department within the Reich Postal Ministry. Telefunken was a joint venture of AEG and Siemens and Halske, which became the leading company for radio technology in Germany. Later it had a competitor, the C. Lorenz Company. The Reichspost started with test transmissions and experimental products like radio telegrams in 1919. When other countries started to have entertainment radio broadcasts, like the Netherlands in 1919, the US in 1920 and the UK in 1922, Germany wanted to follow suit. In March 1923, an entertainment radio broadcast was announced. The first transmission started in October 1923 from the Voxhaus in Berlin. Now this would be a great opportunity to play this first broadcast here, but even though that recording is over 100 years old, someone would make a copyright claim. So please check YouTube or some other place for it. Sorry. However, I can give you a quote from Hans Bredow about the launch of radio broadcasting in Germany. On page 11, in Listening and Being Listened to 1, he is being quoted with the following, which he said on October 14, 1923. In this time of economic hardship and political pressure, radio broadcasting is being made available to the general public. It shall no longer be limited to economic usage, but we shall make the attempt to use this tool of cultural progress to introduce some joy and inspiration to the lives of the German people. Economically, the German people have become impoverished, and cultural impoverishment is also on the rise, because who can afford books and magazines? Who can enjoy good music and entertaining and educating lectures? Recreation, entertainment, and variety can distract the mind from the serious worries of everyday life, and they can also refresh and renew the joy in work. Bredow clearly mentions his goals for radio broadcasting, entertainment, and education. I'll get back to that in a moment. Initially, the Reichspost wanted to get print media like newspapers, etc. on board. The idea to broadcast news via the radio was an obvious one. However, print media was skeptical. They feared they could lose customers, and they also thought that the Reichspost wanted to set up some sort of radio news agency and become a competitor. So the Reichspost had to work without them. Financing was supposed to happen by collecting fees from the listeners. Germany still has such an agency, the GEZ, and basically it's the same principle. Back then, when you bought a radio, you had to sign such a fee contract. However, I'll talk more about costs later. When it came to the content, Hans Bredow tried to keep politics out of the radio broadcasts. His ideal was an entertainment broadcast free of politics. However, politics were involved right from the start. After all, the Reichspost was a state-owned company, and there were no private radio stations. The government had the idea to influence the people in a pro-republic sense and to censor all unwanted content. This fairly undemocratic behavior has to be seen in the context of the time. Germany in the early 1920s was a fairly unstable place. Coups, armed uprisings, those happened a lot. The republic was fairly unstable. In 1923 alone, the country endured the occupation of the Ruhr by the French, suffered through a hyperinflation, and had to fight off the Hitler beer hall coup in Bavaria in November. So the fact that the government took an interested and concerned look at the radio was no surprise. In the end, the Postal Ministry and the Ministry of the Interior found a compromise. Politically neutral people would oversee the radio broadcasts, while the Postal Ministry operated the radio stations. Cultural councillors would censor the cultural program. However, since programming directors were very conservative, these councillors didn't have much to do. Radio culture was far less open-minded and progressive than big city culture of 1920s Germany. Operating this radio service came with technical and organizational challenges. Among the technical challenges were microphones, data lines, and recording devices. Early microphones were fairly bad and had to be optimized for radio operations. The first broadcast suffered from bad microphones and bad audio quality. Initially, there were only few or no data lines between transmitters. Those still needed to be created. Starting in the late 1920s, data lines allowed transmitters to run programs from each other in real time. In theory, it would have been possible to use records for programming, but just like microphones, they just weren't there yet. They were good enough for home gramophones, but not for radio broadcasts. These last two problems meant that nearly everything that was broadcast was done live from the studios. A statistic from the Program History of Radio Broadcasting on pages 360 and following shows this quite clearly. According to this, 92.4% of all broadcasts from the Königsberg transmitter in winter of 1925 came live from the studio. By winter 27, this had dropped to 79.3% and further to 68.9% in winter of 31. The usage of data lines to transmit content from other transmitters increased drastically, from 4% in 1925 to 8.8 in 1927 and finally 19.6 in 1931. Records also saw a rise in usage, from 3.6% in 1925 to 11.9 in 27 and finally 11.3 in 31. An organizational problem was the question how one should actually set up a radio program. The early years were filled with experiments until formats were found that worked well. Especially the spoken content was undiscovered country. Early economic and stock exchange programs were very boring. An announcer would just read columns of numbers. However, quickly new formats came up that we still have today, like inside reports, studio interviews, and on-site broadcasts. But a broadcasting service is worth nothing unless it has listeners and they all need a radio, and that had to be purchased. In order to understand the costs, we need to know what people earned at the time, so let's start with that. The Radio Politics book has some interesting numbers about this on pages 115 and 116. In 1924, the average worker earned between 0.61 and 0.88 Reichsmark per hour. Let's assume that the worker worked 48 hours a week, which could also be more or less, after all these were economically unstable times. Then he earned between 107 and 154 Reichsmark per month. However, since many workers worked more than 8 hours a day, they probably earned something closer to 200 Reichsmark. Employees, so not production workers, earned between 162 and 372 Reichsmark per month, depending on their position. In 1924, the monthly radio fee was set to 2 Reichsmark per month for individuals, 30 Reichsmark for companies. So a worker had to work for 3 to 4 hours to earn the money required for the monthly fee. If he also wanted to subscribe to a radio newspaper, that also meant 2 Reichsmark per month. In theory, you didn't need these papers. However, they were the only way to find out what was being broadcast, on which days, which hour, and on which frequency. Comparison: a regular newspaper subscription was between 2.5 and 3.75 Reichsmark per month. So a subscription for a newspaper compared to a radio with radio newspaper wasn't much different when it came to costs. On top of that were the costs for electricity or batteries. These actually mattered because back then electricity and batteries were still something special. So the running costs of a radio couldn't be ignored. On the other hand, there wasn't really an alternative for music or entertainment content. TV, internet, phones, stereos, all this didn't exist yet. The only alternatives were gramophones, which also cost money, plus you had to buy the records, or you had to sing yourself, play an instrument, which also costs money, plus costs for lessons, or read, and yes, books also cost money. The radio offered a wide range of music and entertainment for a flat rate, something you couldn't have through any other means. Let's take a look at the radio devices themselves. Here you had to differentiate between 3 types: crystal detectors, short-range receivers, and long-range receivers. The crystal detector is a radio which uses a crystal to receive radio waves and also uses these to cover its energy requirements. You can still buy them as DIY kits. They were very cheap, but also very weak. Statistics from the Radio Politics book on page 144 show that in 1928, 626,000 radios were sold in Germany, 186,000 of which were crystal detectors. They only cost around 25 to 30 Reichsmark. However, in order to work, they needed to be very close to the transmitters, and they didn't have any loudspeakers. So you needed headphones and a very quiet environment. So these devices only made sense when a transmitter was very close, maybe 30 kilometers or 20 miles, and when your home was very quiet. The short-range receivers were weak vacuum tube devices. They cost around 110 Reichsmark. Starting in 1926, they came with loudspeakers, and they could receive radio waves from farther away. They required a power supply, so either an electricity grid or batteries, and they were louder. The long-range receivers were the high-end devices, vacuum tube radios equipped with loudspeakers since 1926 that could receive on short, medium and long wave, even if the radio stations were 150 kilometers or 90 miles or further away. However, they cost 380 Reichsmark. So let's add this all up. Let's say we have a worker with a monthly earning of 200 Reichsmark and he wants to buy a radio. 1% of his earnings go to the monthly radio fee. Another percent for the radio newspaper if he wants to have one. On top of that, costs for electricity or batteries. If he wants a cheap crystal detector, he has one-time costs of 15% of his monthly salary. But that device will only work if the radio station is very close and he has a quiet home. If he wants a short-range receiver, then it's already half his monthly salary. And a long-range receiver will cost him almost 2 monthly salaries. Hefty prices for entertainment radio broadcasts. That explains why of the 626,000 radios that were sold in 1928, 186,000 were crystal detectors, 293,000 were short-range receivers, and only 147,000 were long-range receivers. Many radios were paid in installments since most people just didn't have that kind of money just lying around, and they had to pay off the devices over a long time. On top of that, early radios were complicated and needed continued adjustments. Easy-to-use radios only started to show up in 1928. But despite all the costs, all the technical and organizational issues, despite political and economic crisis, the radio flourished and the number of registered radio devices rose steadily. In December of 1923, when the broadcasts had just started, there were only 500 registered devices in all of Germany. However, the amount of listeners was far greater because there were tons of unregistered pirate listeners. These tinkerers often had primitive DIY loudspeakers in their devices until they could replace them with proper ones in 1926. But that's just FYI on the side. In July 1924, so only 7 months later, these 500 registered devices had increased to 99,000. 3 months later, in October 24, there were already 280,000. Half a year later, in April 25, there were 778,000. In April 26, 1.2 million. In 1929, 2.9 million. In 1931, 3.8 million. And keep in mind, this is the number of registered devices. One device provided radio services to all members of a household, plus neighbors and family members. So these 3.8 million devices were used by far more than 3.8 million people. A statistic from the Radio Politics book, page 526, shows how widespread the usage of radio broadcasting was in the entire world in 1932. According to this, there were a total of 38.5 million devices registered in the world, 18.7 million of them in Europe. In first place was the UK with 4.7 million, then Germany with 4.12 million. A quick glance on a couple of other European countries: France 900,000, Sweden 587,000, Switzerland 195,000, Austria 538,000, Italy 763,000, and Poland 314,000. The US had 16.1 million, so only a little less than all of Europe. Canada had 825,000, Mexico 135,000, Brazil 200,000. Japan had 1.2 million, Australia 370,000, and New Zealand 80,000. In most countries, radios were more widespread than telephones in private households. Exceptions were Switzerland, France, the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And cars were also more rare, except in France, US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. In Germany, the Reichspost didn't set up one large central radio station. Instead, just like today, the country was divided into regions that would be covered by one medium-wave radio station. On top of that, there would be one long-wave radio station located in Berlin that should cover the entire country. These were the regions that existed, and to make it easier to understand, I will use the borders of today's German states. The Radio Hour AG, that was Berlin and the surrounding area, starting service on October 29, 1923. The Central German Broadcasting Company Mirag, that was Saxony, Thuringia and Saxony-Anhalt, starting on March 2, 1924. The German Hour in Bavaria, covering Bavaria and the Palatinate, starting on March 13, 1924. The Southwest Germany Broadcasting Service, SWR, in Rhineland-Palatinate, the Saar area, Hessia, and parts of North Rhine-Westphalia, starting on April 1, 1924. The North German Broadcasting Company NORAC in Hamburg, Lower Saxony, Schleswig-Holstein, and parts of Mecklenburg, starting on May 2, 1924. The South German Broadcasting Company Syrac in Baden-Württemberg and parts of Rhineland-Palatinate, starting on May 11, 1924. The Silesian Radio Hour Company covering Silesia, starting on May 26, 1924. The Eastern Borderland Broadcasting Company ORAC in East Prussia and Danzig, starting on June 14, 1924. And finally, trailing behind a bit, the West German Radio Hour Company WFAG in North Rhine-Westphalia and parts of Lower Saxony, starting only on October 10, 1924. The Germany radio station, initially called German Wave, started on January 7, 1926, however it only started having a proper program in September 1926. This was the only long-wave radio station that was operating. This setup caused a few overlaps between the radio stations and also a few dead zones where nothing could be received. These were usually in border areas, like a strip of country at the Belgian border, parts of eastern Frisia, the Bavarian Forest, the southern Black Forest, the far north of Schleswig-Holstein and eastern Pomerania. However, a couple of non-German areas were covered, like the northern Sudetenland, Posen, parts of Alsace-Lorraine and parts of Austria. This caused conflicts with the neighboring countries, which by the way also sent their programs into Germany, and treaties and agreements had to be worked out. The first transmitters were only run with a measly output of 0.25 kilowatts of power. By 1924, there were transmitters in Munich, Nuremberg, Stuttgart, Frankfurt, Münster, Bremen, Hamburg, Hannover, Berlin, Leipzig, Breslau and Königsberg. Later, additional transmitters were built to cover the dead zones and to improve reception in the borderland areas. Among these support transmitters were the ones in Augsburg, Freiburg, Dresden, Kaiserslautern, Aachen, Cologne, Dortmund, Düsseldorf, Elberfeld, Kassel, Kiel, Flensburg, which would be the last operational transmitter in Germany, broadcasting the surrender in May 1945, Magdeburg, Stettin, Danzig and Gleiwitz, this being the one that became known because of the false flag operation by the SS just one day before the start of World War II in Europe. These first-generation transmitters were quickly replaced. In 1931, new large transmitters that were much more sophisticated and had an output power of 60 kilowatts were under construction. The one in Leipzig even had 120 kilowatts. So what did people want to listen to on the radio? There are two polls in the program history book. The first, which you can find on pages 18 and 19, was done by the magazine German Broadcast in summer of 1924. According to this, 83.3% of the listeners wanted to hear operetta, so music. In second place, we can find news. A second poll on page 626 that was done in Silesia in 1926 is much more detailed. The most popular music broadcasts consisted of entertainment music, like German folk songs and music you can dance to, military concerts, marches and traditional folk songs. The least popular music broadcasts were arias, chamber music and choir music. The poll also reveals that in the category of spoken content, the listeners liked radio plays and humoristic content. Dialect content and cabaret were on the last places. So these polls reveal that people preferred light entertainment and music. The programming directors took that to heart and put their focus on that. Light entertainment was more prominent than education and sophisticated entertainment put together. This was the case at all regional radio stations during the entire time. So what exactly was being broadcast? The program history book has a couple of very interesting program structure diagrams on pages 344 to 351 for the regional radio stations and the longwave station. There were broadcasts with certain types of content like news, sports, education and entertainment, mostly music, radio plays and readings, but also broadcasts for specific groups of people, like children, teenagers, parents, schools and teachers, women, rural folk, workers and church groups. There were differences between the regional stations, but overall you can see the following pattern. In 1925, there was one large time slot that started at 15 to 16 o'clock and ran with only a few short breaks until 23 o'clock. Before, there were only a few short broadcasts, and afterwards there was a night break. On Saturdays and Sundays, there was a bit more programming than on weekdays. In 1927, the structure was basically the same but larger. The main block started at around 16 o'clock and ran until midnight. Some stations also had a noon program running from 11 to 14 o'clock and a morning program. Saturdays and Sundays still had more programming than weekdays. By 1929, the main block was basically running from 11 o'clock to midnight with very few breaks. Most stations now had a morning program running from 6:30 to 8 o'clock. In 1931, the main block ran from 11 o'clock to half past midnight. The morning program ran from 6:30 to 8 o'clock, on weekends even to 10 o'clock. The gaps were filled with sporadic programs. The only real break remaining was the night. From these patterns you can see that radio time were the afternoons, the evenings and the weekends. Prime time was from 19 to 22 o'clock. Early afternoon was something for housewives, children and teenagers. And more the morning program established itself. More and more time was filled with programming. To illustrate that, I'll take a look at the Bavarian radio station on pages 360 and following. In 1925, that station had 6 hours and 48 minutes of programming on weekdays, 8 hours 40 minutes on Saturdays and 7 hours 45 minutes on Sundays. On average, there were 8 to 13 different programs per day. By 1931, this had increased drastically. Weekdays consisted of 11.5 hours of programming, weekends of more than 13 hours. On any day, 21 to 24 different programs ran. The ORAC in East Prussia started with only 4 to 5 hours per day in 1925, but quickly followed suit. The most industrious was the Berlin station, which sent 17 hours of programming per day in 1931. On weekdays, half of all content was music, the other half was spoken content, so basically 50-50. On weekends, music was more prominent, around 66 to 33. Light entertainment music was the biggest individual content, 30% on weekdays, more than 50% on weekends. There were differences between regional radio stations, but basically these numbers were stable in all regions and all years. One more thing regarding music content. It was mostly German and regional music. Music from other countries was rare, and if it was broadcast at all, it was usually from European neighbors. Later there was even a bit of program exchange there. Jazz from America was seen very critical and therefore rarely broadcast. Again, radio was much more conservative than big city culture of that time. In the program history book, there are a few examples of daily programming plans. The range of programming was surprisingly wide. You have programs that you expect, like news, weather, sports and concerts, but there was also stuff that is surprising, like educational content in foreign languages like English, and audio trainings in topics as diverse as chess, accounting and farming. And in the morning program you might even find a physical fitness program. In 1925, advertising found its way into the radio, which allowed the radio stations to earn more money. At the same time, news became a more prominent part of the radio broadcasts. The wireless service ran articles from press agencies and there were newspaper reviews. However, the stations didn't have their own reporters yet. In 1929, the Reichspost set up their own shortwave service for worldwide broadcasts. That way, Germans abroad and anyone interested in listening could be reached. However, this had no real impact on radio broadcasting within Germany. In 1928, the Reichspost also started tests with television. However, the time just wasn't right for this yet. While the tests were quite promising, technology, costs and infrastructure just weren't really there yet. The test transmissions were broadcast over the FM band, which is still used for radio broadcast today. Setting up and operating a proper radio broadcasting system was a question of national pride, and there was sort of an arms race when it came to that during the 1920s and 30s. This may explain partially why economic crises didn't seem to affect the development of the radio back then. As the Weimar Republic started to deteriorate in 1930, politics became more and more involved in radio broadcasting, basically ending Bredo's ideal of broadcasts free of politics. Honestly, it had never been really free of politics. Reichschancellor Wilhelm Marx made his first radio broadcast on December 25, 1923, with his Christmas greeting. However, at least there were no political ads or propaganda programs on the radio. Politics was limited to the news and reports with very few exceptions. Before the parliamentary elections in December 24, several party representatives did speak on the radio. During the presidential elections of 25, the candidates Wilhelm Marx and Paul von Hindenburg spoke on the radio. The candidate of the Communist Party did not. Before the parliamentary elections of 1930, there were again several party representatives on the radio, however no Nazis or communists. And during the presidential elections of 1932, both Reichschancellor Heinrich Brüning and Reichspräsident Paul von Hindenburg made speeches on the radio, while Adolf Hitler was not allowed to do that. Next to these sporadic appearances of politicians on the radio, there were a few political programs, like Thoughts of Our Time. In 1929, this program discussed a number of topics of current interest, like pro and against the death penalty, economic development and salaries, alcohol abuse, election reform, reform of unemployment insurance, United States of Europe, a utopia, discussion about the German armed forces, foreign policy aspects of the Young Plan, and financial and economic aspects of the Young Plan. Now you might think that the Nazis turned this neutral radio into a propaganda platform, but that is actually wrong. After Heinrich Brüning was dismissed by President Paul von Hindenburg in late May of 1932, the right-wing conservative Franz von Papen became the new head of government. His government took several steps that damaged the Weimar Republic beyond repair. Among these was the end of neutrality on the radio. Starting in June 1932, time slots were installed for party politicians. Only the Communist Party was banned from speaking on the radio. The Communists tried to get broadcasting time on the Soviet shortwave radio station Radio Moscow. However, the Soviets refused. They preferred their own German-language propaganda broadcasts. The first party politicians started holding their speeches in late June 1932. The government set up its own program called the Hour of the Reich Government, which allowed it to address the people directly, bypassing traditional print media. This program had a length of 30 minutes and was broadcast by all regional stations and the longwave station. It was started by the Minister of the Interior in June 1932. So the radio became the mouthpiece of the government, and it used it extensively. Reichschancellor Franz von Papen used it 18 times in the 6 months he was in office, and that was only himself, not counting all his ministers holding their own speeches. Additionally, the government started transforming the news service, the so-called wireless service, according to its own thoughts. So when the Nazis took over in January 1933, the pioneer work was already done. Reichspropaganda Minister Goebbels just had to continue this transformation. Finishing words. This is also an overtime episode, but I think this is necessary with this topic because so much has to be covered. Radio was the first modern mass media in existence, and it became extremely vital during World War II. TV and the internet followed, but the pioneer that is still around is the radio. It is fascinating to see that despite all problems, radio became widespread very quickly. The technology was still in its infancy, there were political and economic problems, even the electrical grid wasn't finished. And yet by the end of the Weimar Republic, radio was well established within the media environment of Germany. This piece of history also showcases how a democracy can slowly turn into an autocracy or dictatorship as soon as someone grabs control of the media. Until mid-1932, radio broadcasts were politically neutral. Then the Papen government took control and used the radio to spread its propaganda. In the end, this was unsuccessful. The only party supporting the Papen government was the right-wing conservative German National People's Party, which in all elections of 1932 and 33 remained below 10%. But it demonstrated what was possible, and Propaganda Minister Goebbels, who took control of the radio broadcasts in spring of 1933, quickly showed the world how you can use the radio, or any type of mass media actually, to manipulate and control public opinion in the interests of the new regime. And that's what will be discussed in the next episode about radio history in Germany. Thank you for your interest.